Mr. Liu from OnDeck. Before we get started with that, a couple of logistical points. Splunk is kind enough to pick up the bill tonight. They've got some sheet, so if you have a chance, please go ahead and put your name and company on here so that they can have that list. We've got that around, starting with our paper heads from Splunk. We're looking for 30 presenters. So I put this gentleman on the spot, and thank you again. And he's come through with an explanation on tonight. So anyone else who's interested has some ideas, please let us know. I personally take up next one. I might do next meetup. So I will probably take a little ideas. But I will be back in the spring. Coming this summer, we're going to be working with building a hackathon. We're thinking about doing a red team, blue team activity. Specifically using Splunk as feeding data in, and then need some help to ahead and build a solution that we can use with a meetup. So anyone who's interested with that, please see me before you get the majors and make sure talks are out how we're do that. Any other ideas?
So even with meeting on, we still meet?
Yes.
We still meet the last Wednesday every month.
But I'm the most important person in the
it's the last month, Wednesday every month, and so you keep track about
Oh yeah. So if you're not familiar, the Slack channel does. We have our own. It's becoming more active every day. Great information. You are related to Splunk, using Splunk. We also hire a seat, but majority of conversations these days is the Slack channel. So if you need access to it, this is still Splunk402.com. You can self-register yourself. Right?
It's not just speakers. You don't do it to have a meeting about the specific topic you want to hear about that we either haven't covered or want to cover something different. We don't know the way. Definitely do that.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Goffin here is going to go ahead and take on our web podcast. So live streaming this on YouTube and on or recorded replay later on. We'll be posting that information on Slack channel, and also following this your slides hopefully. We'll give you slides presentation to upload on the site. Yep. Okay. So anyone else have any other orders of business to talk about before we started? Great. Well, again, welcome everyone. We're excited to have you here. This is just keeping growing. We started this a year ago, and we've really come a long way. So thank you again, and welcome. Good luck. All right.
Thank you. So this is going to be a talk about deploying Splunk Enterprise Security. So this is a talk if you're thinking about looking into enterprise security as a SIM tool, or if you're new to ES, or 6 months, year into deployment. A little bit about myself. I'm Will, and I'm currently a security engineer at OnDeck Capital, which does online small business loans. So if you're interested in a small business loan, you apply online, and the idea is that it's quicker to apply. Similar to Rocket Mortgages, but only for small business loans. So I've been doing that for about a year at OnDeck Capital, and at OnDeck we have enterprise security as our SIM tool. And I was previously in a IT rotational program, where one of my rotations, I did a year in a SOC as an analyst, and that's where I really got my first exposure to SOC, to Splunk, in a daily manner, in a production environment. And then this talk is based on Splunk Enterprise 651 with ES 450. So if you run different versions, different implementations, slightly different. Splunk is always constantly adding features and different things and Splunk Enterprise in general. So the agenda is I'm first going to cover at a high level about SIM technologies. Then I'm going into the planning phase of enterprise security, following it, configuring it, and finally troubleshooting and best practices. And a lot of it's going to go into kind of pitfalls of where we got stuck in deploying enterprise security because there are a lot of services we can make deploying another tool. So my hope in this is that we don't fall from the same issues that we have, our mistakes. Why Splunk Enterprise Security and how does it compare with other enterprise SIM technologies? So one thing is that in terms of the documentation perspective, it's not as strong as other SIM tools. So I previously used RSA Archer a little bit, and what I've seen in comparison in terms of documentation ability for analysts, other systems might be stronger in that manner, and that's why within OnDeck we're looking at integrating Splunk Enterprise Security with our ticketing environment in Jira. But Splunk does have its environment, which I learned as a SOC analyst, and one thing is that it's very fast and robust. So if I wanted to do query, found out that Splunk was my go-to tool versus other tools where I might need to wait 5 or 10 minutes for data to come back, which for a SOC analyst, and if there's a lot of alerts coming in, that could chew up into your time, and that might mean that you keep spilling up, which is very stressful for an analyst to go through. And then in terms of customization, the data onboarding process, while with other SIMs it might be easier for certain specific types of data, if you have any custom applications, Splunk will, in terms of customizing and parsing those logs out so for whatever custom applications you have within your environment.
Well, it's possible your microphone is on.
Let me.
It is. Can you turn it off?
Let's see. I don't know how to mute it.
I think I'm picking up.
Yeah. I don't know how to.
This guy, right?
Yeah, I don't know how to mute my mic though. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to mute the mic.
All right.
Can you mute it from your end?
I'm trying to do that. Let's see.
And then, how many people come from a security background in this audience? Okay, so almost everyone. This slide might not be for you, but still, I wanted to give a higher level overview. I cover any terms that you're not familiar with anyone. So, for example, an alert is a login entry. So, for example, a failed password attempt. One failed password attempt. An alert would be something that's triggered up with a correlated search for enterprise security. So, for example, if you have 5 failed logins, then that would be an alert. On by an incident, wherein something that impacted within the business. So, failed logins that you discovered because someone found the credentials of one of your users. That would be an incident. But most importantly, I wanted to clarify the difference between SIM and SIM sound the same. So one is Splunk is you have a common information model, and then the other one is with the security incident event manager, which is your security tool where you aggregate all your logs and then you correlate your searches. And this is what Security Operations Center uses. And feel free if you have any questions or anything to jump right in. So one of the things I'm going to cover the most on is the hardware requirements, because that's where we at OnDeck we understood the hardware requirements, but that doesn't necessarily mean exactly followed it. Some of that was decisions on have a choice on hardware you're given. Design decisions, adopting trade-offs. So I'm trying to point out some of the trade-offs I'm looking at when designing enterprise security. And so in terms of hardware requirements, it's different from normal Splunk. For example, where indexers are 32 gig, 16 cores. And this rule of thumb is about 100 gig per day per indexer. But this depends on the type of data that you're also ingesting. You have data that is fairly routine and is the same every day. Say you're pulling out updates and it happens around the same time. That data isn't going to be as intensive and it's not going to hit your indexers as hard as, for example, firewall logs, which is high cardinality. IPs change a lot. So in that case, you're going to ingest smaller amount of gigabytes per day. Provision more powerful indexers or additional indexers per environment. And then also recommended is you have dedicated enterprise security search heads for this. And then if you run a virtualized environment, which at OnDeck we do, account for about 10 to 15% reduced performance and overhead because of that virtualization. And then for disk space, make sure space can write to disk quick enough for your environment for this. And then Splunk uses acceleration, so you need to account for that disk space. And that factor is about 3.4 to 4x. So for example, if you're ingesting about 100 gig per day, then plan for about having storage about 400 gigs a day then, just to be safe. And this is a story about when things broke at OnDeck. So this on the right side is the minimum recommendations, and this is what we have on the left. So when we discovered things broke, when we hit the 350 gig threshold, that's when we found out that it is possible for a whole index cluster to go down, which is really bad. So if you don't know what that means, it means that you're not writing data to disk, and that hopefully your forwarders are, the data is being queued up in the buffers and the forwarders. And if those get filled, it could result in potential data loss, which is pretty bad. It's the worst thing you can get. And I think, and we quickly learned what resulted was we had indexers that were under provisioned. It wasn't ready to handle the amount of data that we were throwing at it. And what resulted is that if one indexer started falling, then they started hitting the other indexers harder, and then those started to fail, and that's how the whole cluster went down about one by one. So that's a lesson. When planning out requirements, just make sure you have enough hardware for this. So we quickly fixed that, and now we have additional hardware. We threw 2 additional indexers and 2 additional enterprise security search heads. And we found that now our environment is more stable, and we haven't had the daily issues that we've had before with our indexers constantly going down and up and down again.
Hey, well, what kind of storage do you guys use?
We use NFS storage, which is not recommended. What is recommended is that you use some sort of flash type storage for your hot and warm buckets. And then going back also, these are the minimum requirements for indexers, but for Splunk Enterprise Security, they recommend that you go with the high performance specifications, which are more than this. So something to keep in mind.
I actually think that NFS as disk space for hot and warm is technically an unsupported config. So please don't do that.
Needless to say, we are looking into other options at this moment. But again, that's one of the trade-offs you need to think about, the existing hardware you have in your environment and kind of the implications of what that will happen to your Splunk ES environment. And for us, it meant that we had reduced performance on indexers. And then, not to be cheesy, but when you're thinking about deploying Splunk Enterprise Security, make sure you have the hardware resources and technical, but also people. So if you don't have enough people, there's two ways you can approach this. You can, one, hire additional consultants. You can have Splunk professional services, or you can hire people through a reseller. There's a large variety of consultant firms around DC. There's a couple in this room, actually, too. And then if you're looking to hire someone, just keep in mind certifications are your minimum baseline. You shouldn't use them as a hiring criteria or any sort of filtering for HR. They're just baselines, and they're exactly that. A good test might be during an interview to ask someone how they would architect Splunk, or show me an example of how you would run a specific search, or maybe certain prompts. That would be a better mechanism than relying just on certifications. And then always remember the consumer. And for enterprise security, usually your consumer would be a security operations center, where analysts are going through your alerts. And that's not always the case, but in some environments, there might the IT engineering and the analysts might not either communicate very well, or they might be under certain different organizations. So before deploying, just make sure that everyone's on the same page, that you have the same goals. Because if you don't have those early discussions, that could lead into issues later on. For example, your engineering team might turn on alerts that are then overwhelming and leading to burnout for your analysts, or they might not be actionable. And those are kind of the conversations and relationships you want to develop before deploying, before actually onboarding enterprise security, or any sort of SOC. And then for architectural considerations, make sure you have ES on its own dedicated search head. And this should be owned by the security team, not other teams. And some apps we found out do not work well with enterprise security, because enterprise security uses so many resources on the search head that installing other extraneous apps could result in reduced performance, including skip searches. So we accidentally deployed a Gigamon app out onto our search head, and we found out that was causing some additional skip searches. We're seeing some reduced performance from that. So that's something to keep in mind and look for. And then also, when thinking about your architecture, do you want a standalone search head, or do you want a search head cluster? A search head cluster is distributed, but it's going to require more work in terms of configuring and setting it up. But that also means that if you ingest more data into your environment, then you can just add another search head, so it horizontally scales. Versus if you're a small shop, then maybe a standalone is better, having one beefy search head that's easier to maintain. So that's a consideration you should think about when doing enterprise security, whether you want it on a search head cluster or if you want it as standalone. And then there's some caveats. If you use a search head cluster, we haven't encountered this, but if you have large lookups, that may not work well. So you might have to find another solution for that. And this is just a diagram of what Splunk Enterprise Security at a high level should look like. You have your indexers on the bottom, and then you have your normal enterprise search head, which may be used by, for example, IT or DevOps or analytics. And that will be separate from your enterprise security search head, which will be owned by security. And so that makes aggregate separating role-based app. That makes it easier to implement controls, access to different data, and permissions. It makes it easier to implement. And this is something more from a project planning perspective for log sources. If you're for onboarding a SIM, make sure you have the data sources that are needed to be successful. So for example, specific example is if you want a correlated search on authentication failures, but you don't have, or you're not planning on ingesting log sources that are based around authentication, then that correlated search isn't going to work. It sounds obvious, but once you start onboarding, then you kind of figure that out. For example, you should probably, maybe you have like something like Active Directory logs coming in, or RSA logs coming in to fit underneath that authentication data model. And then make sure you know what your use cases for your SIM are, and then what kind of correlated search you want to enable, and then also your project requirements and timeline. And I'm mentioning this is because we're a year into our Splunk Enterprise Security and deployment, and it hasn't gone as fast as it should have, and a lot of that is, do you have the log sources already in your environment? Are they already correctly tagged and parsed? Because if they're not, then if you have strict project timelines, for example, you need this deployed within 6 months, then you're going to have a struggle where you're going to find out that your blocker might be getting those logs into your environment. And then you find out that the add-on wasn't built properly, and then you have to go and fix that. So it's going to be an uphill struggle if you don't plan and think about realistic project timelines for onboarding enterprise security. So then in the ideal world, you have everything already, and you just do a couple clicks, and then you have your SIM deployed. But in reality, enterprise security is only going to be as good as the data you're feeding into it. So installing enterprise security, it's actually fairly easy to install enterprise security. You recommended that you have Splunk professional services for the initial deployment, and they'll help you install it and then make sure you're doing everything correctly. You have enough data for ES to work properly. And then it's just an app at the end of the day. It's less than 50 megabytes. You install it on a clean search head. What that means, clean search head, is that you have a search head where you haven't removed any applications and where you haven't installed any additional applications. And you can use a deployment server when installing ES. And just hit continue. And then in this step, you want to make sure that you take a careful look at that you only enable the add-ons that you need. So for example, if your environment doesn't have blue code, then you probably want to either disable or exclude that add-on from enterprise security. And if you forget to do this step, then what results is now you have an add-on that you're never going to use that's going to chew up resources on your enterprise security search head that you could have used for something else. But I was recently reading the documentation, and for spring 2017, it appears that Splunk is going to change that area where currently with Splunk Enterprise Security, it includes a lot of add-ons out the box. But in 2017, there's going to be no add-ons, so you'll have to go into Splunk base and individually add the add-ons that you want for whatever vendor you have to parse those logs. And then I just want to reiterate with regards to the search head, keep it clean, keep it minimal, and that's due to the amount of resources consumed by enterprise security. And this is part of the configuration phase, but the way ES works is you need to import those applications inside ES. So if your add-ons do not fall under the specific naming schema, then it's not going to be imported inside ES. And the implications of that is that if your add-on isn't imported into ES, ES isn't going to correctly parse that data out. And you can find that out, or you can use that as a troubleshooting step by going to search.cert and then go to search. And this will show you the results or your query within the context of ES. And this is important, and you can troubleshoot this, is if you run a search inside normal Splunk and it looks different from a search inside Enterprise Security, that means whatever add-on is parsing and changing that data is incorrectly being imported into Enterprise Security. And this is where you would, and this is where the configuration file would be located. So right here you can see kind of the regex that's used to import those add-ons. So at OnDeck, we have a unique naming schema called OD underscore. So we needed to add this in to import those custom applications that we had, those custom add-ons and apps, Splunk apps that we had into ES. One thing important about ES is that all your data needs to fit under the common information model, which is a way that Splunk models and organizes information and normalizes everything. With all the different vendors, a lot of different vendors have different ways of calling source IP, but Splunk has one way to normalize all that data. And if your data that's coming in doesn't fall under within the common information model, ES isn't going to see that data. It's not going to recognize that as a source IP because it's looking for a specific field, specifically named source IP. And out there on what the common information model is, so you can go in and audit kind of your data to make sure that whatever add-ons you're using are SIM compliant. And then also, if you go on splunkbase.com, it's very small, and it took me a while to discover this. It looks like it's actually off page. But on the lower right-hand corner, an app will show you the Splunk versions it's compatible with. It's a little bit cut off here, but it will also show you the SIM versions that it is compliant with. And something to think about is our data models. When onboarding logs, this is the way I like to think about onboarding data, is what kind of data model it will fall under. And data events are mapped to data models based on tags. So if you don't have the correct tag, it's not going to fall under that data model. So for example, in this specific case on authentication, Splunk is going to recognize that event falling under the authentication data model if it's tagged authentication. And it's going to recognize it as a default authentication if it has both the tag default and authentication into it, tagged for it. And without those tags, it's not going to fall under that correct data model, which may result in a correlated search that isn't working the way it ideally should. So during the onboarding phase, think about what kind of use cases you have. So for example, if you have use cases around malware, make sure you have antivirus logs or your logs from whatever on-host incident response tool you have. And also, when thinking about onboarding, think about your easy wins. So for example, we found out that the correlated searches around the authentication data model were easy wins because they had not too many false positives, and they were the data was a fairly good source already. And then also the acceleration revolves around the data models. So what acceleration is precompiled statistics. You're essentially exchanging disk space for speed. So I'm just throwing random numbers out, but for example, a search under an accelerated data model may take 20 seconds. But if you run the same search without acceleration, it may take, for instance, 20 minutes. And it makes a difference, especially with enterprise security, where you may need actionable data within a quick amount of time. So this is where acceleration becomes an important aspect of it. And at OnDeck, what we found out is that you need to tune the amount of acceleration that you have from the defaults. So we were finding out that a lot of our indexers were being overwhelmed overnight. And we found out that was the case, although it was unusual because there's no users in our environment, there's less data being ingested. What was happening was the acceleration was occurring overnight and hitting our indexers. So what we needed to do to fix that was scope down. So instead of maybe having a year of accelerated data, scope it down to your use case, maybe 90 days or 30 days for accelerated data to reduce the overhead and impact it's going to have on your indexers. And this is a map of the 30 different SIM data models as of this moment, and this is for SIM version 4.7. So with every version, Splunk makes changes to the data models. They're not significant, but they do make some changes. They either add data models or tweak it a little bit. This is a joke, but so out of the box, Splunk comes out with 60 correlated searches. And I've heard of some situations, but never encountered it, where people have turned on all 60 correlated searches, which is not the way a SIM works. Every IT environment, is unique and different. And this is why you can't just simply turn on all 60 out the box, because that's where bad things happen really, really quickly. And one of the reasons is, I haven't highlighted that, which each correlated search, it takes roughly 1 core from your search head. So let's say you turn on all 60 search heads. The question I'm going to ask is, do you have 60 cores to sustain that kind of throughput? Because if you don't even think about turning off all 60. And just with any sort of SIM environment, you'll need to tune and adjust this for your environment. For example, you might not care about failed logins from X, Y, and Z machine asset, but you might care about the user that is failing your login. So those are kind of the tuning that you may need to do to your environment so that it makes sense to your analysts and it's actionable. And then I haven't done this personally, but I was at Splunk.com. You can use T-stats to leverage your data models so that they come out a lot quicker. And then if you have any searches that are using more resources than you anticipated, then you can use Job Inspector for that. And then I personally recommend chasing, but this depends on your use case. So if you have things maybe like a single sign-on where it's critical, if it goes down, they need to know. A real-time search. But at OnDeck, where the company is 700 to 800 people, where our security team is limited in terms of people and time and resources, realistically, we're not going to get to that alert within minutes. It might be minutes on a good day, hours on a normal day. So this is, in this situation, that's where we decided to do our searches to scale, our correlated searches. But again, that's dependent on your environment and your needs.
How much capacity did you get back when you made that change?
From scheduled to real time?
No, from real time to scheduled.
I also don't have the numbers from that because I never bothered with real time to begin with. I've used real-time searches on an ad hoc basis, but that's only a very limited use case where I've used real-time for that.
Hey, well, is the default, and this is related, is the default for all correlated searches to be real-time? Is that why they eat up a core, basically? Is that kind of the recommendation, is that you're switching it from real-time to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not all of them are real-time. Sorry. No.
Okay. Didn't know that. All right. So now I'm going to move. Okay. So this is on our troubleshooting and best practices page. Frozen. I'm getting some spinning box. It must be it, or the crash. Yeah, yeah, it seems to have crashed. But I can post. I probably have about 5 more slides left. So I'm close to the end. Yeah, it's still not. Bear with me while I do this. That's not it. I was going to say for troubleshooting enterprise security, good app during your planning phase and during your deployment, and for planning and for troubleshooting is Splunk ES Health Check. It's a really great tool, and it'll kind of give a large dashboard and overview of what's good and bad with your environment. So for example, if you're finding any searches that are skipped, it will tell you. So skip search, what a skip search could mean is that your correlated searches are not firing off, maybe because there's too many resource overhead, which means if there's an actual alert that should have fired off, like that search that got skipped, then that could be something you're missing from your environment.
It's a good question. Is that an additional app with, or does it come with it?
It does not come with ES, so that's an additional app you have to install.
It works without something, an app that should use.
Yeah, it'll work without ES. So you can use it for pre-planning. Not everything will work. It will work for your pre-planning. It might tell you if you're under provisioned for hardware. It might, if for example, hardware under provisioned. So if it's not meeting the minimum recommended specs, it will tell you. Good for troubleshooting, for example, if you have incomplete accelerated data models, that might tell you that your indexers are not able to handle the accelerations that are handling overnight, or that you need to tune your accelerations. App normal to have. This is optional, but it should be a requirement, and that's having your assets and identity information loaded into your SIM environment. The way we have it is we have a nightly search against our LDAP, and that goes in a lookup, then we load into enterprise security. And what that does is that adds context to the data that you have. So it's not merely this IP failed to log in. Might tell you to log in, or this username belongs to this user and their manager is X, Y, and Z. Or for example, it was a large organization, maybe your asset and identity information might tell you if it's an executive. So that might be important for that context. And these are this is an exhaustive list. You can go online. There's more ways you can load this kind of asset and identity information.
Do you use multiple asset identity tables, or do you use one as an authoritative source?
For asset and identity?
Yeah.
Right now we only have one, but we're planning on adding more information into it. In terms of, this is a reasonable automation for best practices, selectively turn on your correlated searches, starting with your easy wins to demonstrate its value. For example, authentication. One, scheduled searches versus real-time searches. And then alerting is important, especially since enterprise security requires so many resources. And this is alerting so that, for example, if your index cluster goes down, you're alerted so your engineers know to fire it back up again. And then there's a variety of different tools you can use to troubleshoot and diagnose any issues that you have. So you can use ES Health Check, you can use vTool. Is the app imported into your environment? Is it correctly parsed and tagged? So even Splunk Splunk apps may not be correct, which I've found personally. Like for example, when we did our initial deployment, hundreds of default failed logins, and what the result of that was, we had an add-on that was incorrectly tagging every login authentication. So as a result, every user that logged in, it thought was default. So then those are the kind of the considerations that you think about if there's something that's not going on completely correct within the environment. Monitoring console, it's formerly known as DMC, but as of 6.5, it's called Monitoring Console. Helpful with troubleshooting any sort of issues that you've had. So for example, it can tell you what searches are hitting either your search heads or indexers the hardest. It can also tell you if you've lost any folders. And then, I don't know as of which version, but there's a little health check that you can use to see if there's any sort of configuration mistakes that you have made. And this is not specifically ES, this is just Enterprise, just Splunk in general. I'm pointing it out because in the course of deploying ES, we found a lot of issues, and this has greatly helped at troubleshooting issues are. And I'm gonna wrap it up by saying that there's a lot of resources out there in the Splunk community if you have any issues running into deploying your enterprise security environment. So I've found a lot of help within the ES channel on Slack, but there's also IRC, and then there's also Splunk Answers, and if you have bought the support, Splunk technical support. Anyone have any questions or?
You mentioned that the data gets tagged, and then ES sees those tags and puts it into an information model. How does it get tagged?
So it gets tagged through your add-ons. Add-ons are these additional modules that you can find on Splunk-based that can help you tag whatever vendor or data source that you're coming in. So for example, with Cisco ASA, there's a Cisco ASA add-on that you can install into your Splunk environment. And then within that add-on, though, there's a tags.conf specific file. And source types or other fields that it recognizes, it will tag that. It will add those tags.
Okay.
So you have to add that into the TA?
The what? If in order for data to be tagged, you'll need a tags.conf for that. A lot of add-ons have those tags. For the custom application, or you're building a custom add-on, you're going to have to add that. And then you're also going to do some of the paperwork behind thinking, for this data source, what kind of data model should this fall under? And what kind of tags you want to add onto that.
And just to add, if I may, people might want to add data like data center or locality specific to your environment. So if you have data coming from multiple data centers within your environment, and you want all the hosts that are in that environment to have that tag associated with it, that's something that you would build into your own custom tag compile. You can use deployment app, create your own deployment app to create that and push it out so that you have that in your environment.
Is the Splunk monitoring console, is that included, or is that also under the?
It's included. It's on the, since we have a search head cluster, it's on our master node.
You do have to enable it for these there.
Yeah. But recommended nonetheless. It's proven its worth in many situations.
How many IOPS do you have on your current index? I
I actually don't know the benchmark. My lead knows how many IOPS we have, but I think the answer is not enough. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons people are going with SSD. I have contention because less of the problem and allows your CPU cycles to be much faster at being switched on.
And then you might find some unusual things that come with NFS, which we found. So not recommended. You can still use it, but just make sure that you have the hardware people that know enough about NFS to support it, which at OnDeck we don't. But if you're, I imagine if you're a huge bank, then you might have people that really know NFS that can make it work. It's just been a lot of pain.
See if it's still picking up everything you think should.
So
the detections basically just at intervals, just to make sure everything is still functioning.
So we're not. I should say this, but I do occasionally. So far it's been a manual process, but occasionally I do go into our environment to make sure everything's working properly. Been situations where I found we've had or things that aren't being correctly parsed because either deployment didn't go through or a weird upgrade. Your work's not done once everything is done. Things do happen, and you need to always keep an eye out for that, which is where alerting comes in. We haven't. We haven't had too many issues with time delay. Usually it's because time zones have been incorrectly set for that. But I do know, I'm aware of indexer problems. Analysts, we've ran into issues where data was coming in half an hour late. So that's definitely something to consider about. But within our environment, most indexer delays have been not a result of delays, but because the data was incorrectly time zoned.
What kind of sources are you bringing in besides the authentication?
So we're bringing in firewall logs, some Windows security event or Windows event logs, and a lot. End host, whatever endpoint tools that we have, we're bringing those on, such as AV or any sort of IR tools that are picking up whatever's in memory into our environment. But I think the biggest consumers are IDS logs, Pro logs, firewall logs.
Do you have any external data sources like metrics feeds or any other non-OnDeck generated data that you bring in?
We're not there yet. So I do have a last slide follow up with that. Enriching ES. You can have threat intel feeds, Stix, Facebook Exchange, or Taxi, any of your threat intel feeds. You can ingest domain analysis tools. I'm just throwing it out, domain tools, but it can be anything else. And that just enriches your domain. For example, if a user clicks on a link and you can use this domain analysis to find out this has been recently registered in the same week. That's suspicious in itself, and that's something you should take a look at. Whereas if the link or the website has already been registered for 2 years, maybe false positive. And then you can also do workflow actions in this new thing called adaptive response. But I haven't added it because we're not there yet.
That'd be a great talk for somebody who's done it.
Yeah.
Anyone got it? No one's gonna volunteer?
That's how Will got stuck in coffee.
I know.
That could be a great follow-up talk for anyone.
So we'll have you do it again in 6 months.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that, if you can, you get out of virtual to do physical, but if you absolutely must do virtualized hosts, you can do virtualized hosts that pass the LUNs through as raw disk rather than using virtual disk. And
and that helps with the overhead. It should be dropped.
So, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. Virtual for speed. But if you must do virtual hosting, if you pass the physical ones to your virtual hosts rather than pass virtual bits, your overhead shouldn't be 10 to 15, it should be like 1 to 3%.
And it's even less if you're using some of the newer SSD flash stacks. I'm working on a project now with all flash stack solution here with VMware over native capabilities with the flash stack running VMware. We do have UCS running blades for the indexers, and really component of virtualized too. But yes, it's the architecture. Yeah. All right. Any other questions today? Come on, pick me up.
There's a lot of new faces tonight. So.
Maybe did you integrate that with Splunk?
Splunk?
Yeah, like you take it to
so we're not fully done with that project yet.
what are you guys doing right now? What the plan?
So the eventual plan is we integrated with Jira so that an analyst can create a ticket and then have it in Jira for that. But we're not there yet. So
is that like an adaptive response, or is it auto-generated?
I'm not the point person on that, but it might be. Actually, I don't know how we're actually implementing and doing that, or how the developer on our team is doing that. But I can circle back with them, and if you have some contact information, I can link back up with you.
Topic suggestion.
But I've also seen people do hybrid.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard people do hybrid SIM environments where they might have an ArcSight and a Splunk ES hand in hand. We don't have the money for that, or nor do we have any sort of legacy tools, but that's certainly an option for someone to kind of ease your way into ES, or if you want to stand up both environments.
So you said you use Archer as a SIM?
That's not with OnDeck.
I don't know Archer was a SIM.
It's not. It's more for documentation. Security analytics is the SIM component of RSA. It's closely tied in with Archer. But I've had a couple months experience with that before I'm rotated off that team.
If I'm building ES cluster, does each one of those certificates in cluster have to meet those requirements that you have? You know, can I sort of say, okay, each one of them got 8 CPUs?
So it's kind of a trade-off that you have to do. You don't have to, we don't meet those minimum requirements. And it's worked for us, but that's kind of to think about. If you vastly unprovision it, will it still work? It may not, so you may need to be close to those minimum specifications. But at least at OnDeck, since we have a search engine cluster, it still works. We're under the minimum specifications, but we're close.
You get the alerts on it? If you're under thing?
The alerts on it. But actually, during our initial deployment, we did skip searches because we didn't have enough search head power to get that working. These things, you're kind of moving the problem from one way to another. Is something to think about. Like we've had issues where we add more search heads and that hits our indexers more. So now we need to add more indexers. So the answer to that is it depends. So for example, here you need to have minimum 32 gig of memory, but we have 16. We have 14. It still works in our environment, but it's kind of a trade-off that you need to make.
You play with your limit stack up to up the maximum searches?
I do know we've altered our limits.conf. I don't know to what extent we've altered it, but I know we've changed that setting on it.
One thing that they're saying right now you don't ever want to do is change the per core number of searches from one set to default. That's just going to slow your ES down overall.
they're saying, don't do that, but you can change your percentage of what's being run as accelerated and versus what it's not. But that one flag of the per core search, so you don't change it.
So it's regular.
Yeah, my second you shouldn't change that. And that's coming from like all of the ESCs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One search, one core.
So for the person that asked about the Jira integration, I don't remember what it, yeah. So in the custom alert framework, the company 6.3, there's built-in hooks to talk to Jira. So somebody knows how to do it, just have to configure your credentials. Workload actions that you have there. So a lot of the background plumbing is stuff where you just have to look into it. There is definitely not on it.
Thank you.
Yeah. For anyone who's using that service, and I was going to create integration with Splunk for workflow automation.
Any other further questions? All right.
Folks, thanks again for coming tonight. Great job, Mr. Liu. So anyone who's interested in presenting next month, please talk to us. Yes. Last Wednesday of the month, every month this year. So
Send you an email.